Welcome to Truth Behind History. The stories are real, the impact is lasting. Today, we're diving into a disturbing but often overlooked chapter of American history, one that didn't happen in the shadows, but in plain sight. A movement backed by laws, led by elites, and fueled by a belief that certain lives were more valuable than others. Let me ask you something. What happens when a society decides it can engineer perfection? When politicians, scientists, and intellectuals believe they can decide who should reproduce and who shouldn't? That wasn't the plot of a dystopian novel. It was the guiding principle of the American eugenics movement. Eugenics, in simple terms, is the belief that the human race can be improved through selective breeding. But don't let the pseudoscientific jargon fool you. This wasn't about health, or genetics, or progress. It was about power, about control, about deciding who gets to pass on life, and who doesn't. From the late 1800s through the early 1900s, this idea gained real traction in the United States. And I don't mean in backroom circles or crackpot lectures. We're talking mainstream support from lawmakers, respected scientists, and the upper echelons of society. More than 30 states passed actual laws to allow forced sterilizations. Let that sink in. State-sanctioned surgeries to permanently prevent people, usually poor people, disabled people, or minorities, from ever having children. This wasn't just theory. This was policy. This was action. This was America, in the name of science, drawing a line between the fit and the unfit. And yet, somehow, this history is rarely taught, rarely questioned, rarely remembered. But that changes today, because once we understand how deep the roots of this system ran, we can start to ask the harder questions. Who built it? Who funded it? And how far did its influence go? Let's dig deeper. So, who exactly stood behind the curtain pulling the strings of the American eugenics movement? The truth is, this wasn't a fringe ideology running wild on the margins. No, it was institutional, systemic, and frighteningly well-funded. Let's start with the money. The Carnegie Institution, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Harriman family. These weren't small players. These were titans of industry and philanthropy, the kinds of names that built skyscrapers and shaped policy. And they poured money into eugenics research like it was a moral crusade. They funded labs, publications, international conferences, all to promote the idea that society could be perfected if we simply removed the undesirable genes from the population. And where did all this research take place? At the very heart of American academia. Ivy League universities, places that still boast about producing the world's brightest minds, opened their doors to eugenicists. These institutions weren't just passively complicit, they actively provided office space, research facilities, and intellectual credibility to this movement. Scholars who believed in racial hierarchies and biological determinism were treated as cutting-edge scientists. Think about that. The same lecture halls that taught constitutional law and moral philosophy also trained a generation to believe that some lives were less worthy. But the real hammer fell in the courtroom. In 1927, the Supreme Court of the United States handed down one of the most chilling decisions in its history, Buck versus Bell. The court ruled that the forced sterilization of a young woman named Carrie Buck was constitutional. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes delivered the majority opinion and declared, quote, "3 generations of imbeciles are enough." That wasn't just legal validation. That was the United States government giving moral license to a nationwide campaign of reproductive control. This wasn't just theory backed by funding. It was science, supported by elites, embedded in universities, and upheld by the highest court in the land. And the machine was only just getting started. Ready to see what happened when this ideology left the lab and entered the lives of real people? Let's keep going. So now we've seen who built the system, but what did it actually do? This is where the story shifts from disturbing theory to horrifying reality. Because eugenics didn't just live in books or policy briefs, it was enforced on bodies. Real people, with names, with families, with futures that were stolen. Let's talk about who they targeted. The so-called unfit included the mentally ill, the poor, Black Americans, Native Americans, immigrants, children in orphanages, women labeled as promiscuous. The list goes on, but the unifying thread was always powerlessness. These were people who lacked the means to fight back, and that made them ideal targets for a system obsessed with control. Many of these victims were forcibly sterilized without their knowledge or consent. Doctors and state officials didn't ask questions. They didn't offer explanations. In some cases, they told families the procedures were routine or necessary for health. But the real reason? To stop these individuals from reproducing. Imagine being a teenage girl in state custody or a young woman in a mental institution, and waking up to find your reproductive future had been stolen from you permanently because someone decided you didn't measure up to society's idea of fit. And all of this was framed as healthcare. The eugenics movement wrapped itself in the language of science and public health. It claimed it was cleaning up society, promoting hygiene, preventing disease, but underneath that clinical language was a brutal system of racial and social control. Eugenics wasn't just a mistake, it was an engineered hierarchy masquerading as medicine, a form of coercion dressed up as care, and it was happening across America, under state supervision, with the support of the very institutions meant to protect life and liberty. But what if I told you that this wasn't just a uniquely American tragedy? What if the ideas born in the United States would soon find new life across the ocean in one of the darkest regimes in human history? Let's turn the page. If you thought eugenics was just an unfortunate chapter confined to American history, think again. Because the ideas that took root in US soil didn't stay there. They crossed oceans, they shaped ideologies, and they directly influenced one of the most horrific regimes the world has ever known, Nazi Germany. Let's start with the part that rarely makes it into textbooks. Adolf Hitler, yes, that Hitler, praised American eugenics laws. In Mein Kampf, he pointed to US sterilization policies as examples of racial strength and purification. Think about that. The man who orchestrated the Holocaust looked to America as a model for how to cleanse a population. It wasn't just admiration, it was imitation. In 1933, the very year Hitler rose to power, the Nazi regime passed race laws that mirrored California's eugenics statutes, almost word for word. They adopted the same logic, the same terminology, the same categories of unfit individuals. The legal framework for persecution and sterilization in Nazi Germany was built on blueprints that had already been tested in the United States. And it didn't stop at laws. There was active collaboration between American and German scientists. Some US researchers were even invited to Germany. They were honored, celebrated, and held up as pioneers in the field of racial theory. American science wasn't just passively influential, it was part of the ideological foundation that enabled Nazi policies. Let's not sugarcoat it. The American eugenics movement helped legitimize the idea that governments had the moral authority to decide who deserved to exist and who didn't, and the consequences of that influence would soon erupt into genocide. The next slide takes us there. So what happens when a dangerous idea is scaled up, industrialized, and put into the hands of a totalitarian regime? You get the Holocaust. But to truly understand how it happened, we need to zoom in, not just on the violence, but on the systems behind it. The paperwork, the policies, the cold, calculated machinery of death. Nazi Germany didn't start with gas chambers. It started with forms, with files, with sterilizations, with classifications. It started with the same kind of bureaucratic logic that had been tested in the United States. First came the labels, unfit, degenerate, racially inferior. Then came the laws, forbidding marriage between Jews and non-Jews, excluding disabled people from schools and workplaces, criminalizing reproduction by the undesirable. Next came forced sterilizations on a massive scale. Tens of thousands were sterilized under Nazi authority, many of them children. And the methods? Identical to those pioneered in American institutions. This wasn't just influence, it was replication. But the most horrifying turn came when sterilization gave way to extermination. The Nazi regime launched a program called Action T4, a systematic campaign to murder disabled individuals deemed life unworthy of life. Patients were taken from hospitals and psychiatric wards, loaded onto buses, and killed using carbon monoxide. Doctors signed off. Clerks filed the records. It was all shockingly organized. What began as eugenics ended in genocide. Because once you accept the premise that some lives are worth less, that the state has the authority to decide who should live and who shouldn't, there's no limit to where that logic can go. And yet, after the war ended, something strange happened. The eugenicists didn't vanish. The institutions didn't collapse. The story didn't end. It just got quieter. Let's explore that silence. You might expect that after the world witnessed the horrors of the Holocaust, eugenics would have been buried, denounced, utterly discredited. But what actually happened was silence. There were no mass reckonings, no trials for American scientists, no congressional hearings to expose the architects of sterilization programs. The institutions that funded, taught, and promoted eugenics simply pivoted. They rebranded. Many of the same researchers who once wrote about racial purity went on to careers in public health, genetics, and social policy. Some were celebrated, others received grants and awards. The word eugenics may have faded from public view, but the people, and the ideas, never fully left. Let's be clear, the apparatus remained. The bureaucracies didn't dismantle their sterilization programs until well into the 1970s. And even then, in some states, the damage continued unofficially. Coerced sterilizations of poor women, especially women of color, persisted under the guise of welfare reform or population control. And what about the textbooks, the classroom discussions, the national memory? Nothing. For decades, this entire chapter was quietly excluded from public education. It was too uncomfortable, too shameful, too close to home. So we pushed it into the margins. We pretended it had nothing to do with us, but the shadow lingered. Today, we're still grappling with questions about bodily autonomy, medical ethics, and who gets to make decisions about life and reproduction. We debate bioengineering, predictive genetics, and artificial intelligence, often without realizing how much of that conversation echoes old eugenic thinking. When the past is buried without reflection, it has a way of returning, disguised in new language, new technologies, and new justifications. Which brings us to the final question: what does this history demand of us now? Let's wrap it up. So now that we've walked through this forgotten history, what are we supposed to do with it? We can't change the past, but we can confront it, and more importantly, we can learn from it, because history isn't just a record of what happened. It's a mirror. It shows us what systems do when no one is paying attention, what ideas can become when they're given power without accountability. Eugenics was not a story of isolated villains. It was a system built by educated people, funded by elite institutions, enforced through legal channels, and wrapped in the language of progress. That's what makes it so terrifying, because it didn't look like evil. It looked like improvement, efficiency, order, and it teaches us something essential. When governments start deciding whose lives are valuable, when science is used to justify hierarchy, and when people are treated as data points instead of human beings, things can unravel faster than anyone expects. That's why we have to remain vigilant, especially now, as we stand at the frontier of new technologies that promise to reshape humanity itself: gene editing, AI decision-making, biometric surveillance. Are we asking the right questions? Are we remembering the right lessons? Because history doesn't repeat itself word for word, but it rhymes. And if we're not listening, the same moral mistakes will show up wearing new clothes. So here's the challenge: dig deeper, ask harder questions, refuse to forget. And if this episode gave you something to think about, something that shook you or opened your eyes, do me a favor. Like the video, drop a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe to Truth Behind History if you want more content that dives beneath the surface. Also, if you want to listen to this as a podcast episode, the link is in the description, perfect for learning on the go. And hey, if this blew your mind, check out the other episodes on this channel. History isn't dead. It's alive in every system we live under today. Thanks for watching. Stay curious. Stay questioning.